without Robert Mugabe on the ballot paper, but has anything really changed? And are we in for what should be a credible election? To unpack this, of course, we're joined in studio by political analyst Professor David Moore as well. At the same time, we're joined by Mr. Mutumwa Mawere, who is the chairperson for Africa Resources Limited. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Professor, I'll start with you at the same time. First question is credibility. Do you see this being a credible election?
Well, that word has come into the lexicon somewhat late in the game of elections across Africa and the rest of the global south. It indicates in itself that the concept of free and fair, totally, legitimate. The bar has been lowered. So if the violence is relatively low, and it appears it is, I mean, we saw some of the participants before. There's low-level violence, right? That can be seen as acceptable by the powers that be.
Setting the bar very low, though.
Well, it's true. It's true. But I think generally, historically speaking, the enthusiasm for liberal democracy across Africa has diminished a lot. Museveni, Kagame, there's kind of a hope amongst investors and regional powers who don't want instability, that a strong, firm leader can do the job. And there was kind of hopes placed on Emerson Mnangagwa that he might do that. But I think ZANU-PF is a rather fractious entity, and it always has been. So whether that wish, the wish to me really has to stand with credible elections. If the opposition and the supporters for the opposition see a result that they feel they deserve, comes through. And I don't know if you've talked about the recent Afrobarometer poll, which was released.
We haven't yet, but we'll hopefully lend our ear to that in a moment or two at the same time. But I want to bring in you, Mr. Mawere, as well, and just say to you, if in itself we put the bar very low as we currently have with Zimbabwe, and saying that if there's no violence, then it seemingly is a good election. Is that good enough to perhaps boost Zimbabwe's businesses, economy, and perhaps, allay fears to the World Bank and the like as well?
I think first, if you start with credibility, it depends in whose name credibility is written. For the loser, it's always not credible. For the incumbent, obviously you got the state machinery. So when you say lowering the bar, and the world is, I think, is less concerned about who wins or who doesn't. But if you don't have the rule of law, you don't have the respect of rights of persons, then whoever wins and nothing changes doesn't bring any change to Zimbabwe.
But there is a lot of excitement, if you want to call it that, and the only reason I say excitement is because, of course, it's the first time that Robert Mugabe is not on the ballot paper as well, but ZANU-PF does have new leadership. But would you say it's the same kind of leadership that would lead it forward?
I think the naive would say the absence of the person of Robert Mugabe changes characters, but it doesn't. So it's not the person of Mugabe whose absence we should be talking about. What really has changed in terms of governance, in terms of rule of law, in terms of direction, that is what you need to look at. It goes beyond the person. And as business, you feel that it hasn't changed? If it has changed, a duck is a duck. You can see what has changed. If the characters have changed, there will be different characters. What is credible, maybe after 38 years of a monolithic narrative, it may be something else. I think you look at a 38-year-old Zimbabwean and look up the stars and see what is there. Is it shining stars or is it darkness? As long as there's darkness, you can't cure it by changing faces. What lightens Zimbabweans today, just the excitement that even young people are not beholden to an idea that liberation ought to be relevant in perpetuity, and that mistakes of the past can now be lumped on one individual called Robert Mugabe, then that would be naive.
Professor, the army has always sided with ZANU-PF and have always said that they'll only accept a win for ZANU-PF. Do you think that's still going to be the case now, considering that Emmerson Mnangagwa stepped into power using the military and the army as well?
Or did the military use him?
Also true, also possibly, yes.
It wasn't clear. I think Constantino Chiwenga would have gone either way with the G40 if it hadn't been for Grace Mugabe taking that step too far. And of course, Emmerson Mnangagwa, in exile because he was fired and then he left the country because he feared for his life, relied on the military to bring him back in. So that's one thing. We don't know who controls who. Second thing I think is the military is not of one mind about what to do if there's a runoff election, right? So it's 40% now for Mnangagwa, 37%, at least according to the Afrobarometer poll, which is pretty credible. That's 3% difference, it's not much difference. There's 20% who either don't know how they're going to vote or won't tell you how you're going to vote. So split that in half and you get pretty close. It's going to be very close. The decision will be to go for a runoff, because you have to have 50 plus 1 to declare a victory. So if you're 47, 43 and a few of the other parties, and there are many, and some of them are ZANU-PF parties in disguise just to confuse people, what will be the decisions made at that point? If A, there's a victory for Chamisa, or B, there's a runoff. And of course everybody will remember 2008 when there were a runoff, and that's when 170 people were killed and many, hurt badly.
The fear is we'll get to that situation.
The fear is we could go to that. If the subalterns in the military, the young people who are much closer to the people, they have brothers, sisters, cousins living in the townships with them, they're poor, they've been offered a 22% raise, but it doesn't mean anything when the currency is meaningless anyway. So, would they go with the section of the military which wanted to push hard like they did in 2008? It's uncertain. Would there be a mutiny? Or would they take matters into their own hands? So there are all these uncertain ramifications, and you don't want to say one is going to happen, because the serious soldiers, the real professionals, would be aware of what's going on. The regional powers would be aware. Mnangagwa and Chamisa should be aware. So will they make an agreement? Would we go back to 2008 when there was a government of national unity? I think if that was seen as a legitimate response to a very close election that was counted properly, and of course then you have the problems about counting, and you have the problems of does the opposition accept the ballot paper which has Mnangagwa on the top right instead of one column? You know, those sorts of things. There are 4 or 5 issues in the courts now put forward by the opposition about problems with the ballot paper and the voters' roll. But of course, that legal situation won't be resolved until after the election. So then the observers, including the SADC, civil society people, the government observers, the AU, the EU, you name them, they're there in their numbers, just like they were in 2000 before they started, being told they can't come. They have a normative template. The AU norms about free and fair, the SADC norms about free and fair. They're not legal, because in any case the Zimbabwean legal system is kind of
mired itself.
So then the observer missions will have to come to some sort of an agreement. Will they be led by the people on the ground who are really, really seeing some of these ununiformed soldiers intimidating people? Are they seeing people in the National Patriotic Front, which is that split from ZANU-PF? They have been intimidated in some areas, and some people being beaten up. So there are incidents like that. Then the observer missions, will they take their orders from Whitehall? Or what? So there's going to be tough decisions for everyone to make.
A lot of tensions to sort of put out as well, and a lot of questions to be asked of who's doing what and who's doing it where at the same time. But I was speaking earlier about that World Bank debt, which would be very critical to allowing Zimbabwe to start borrowing again in future if they can work their way to getting the World Bank to erasing that debt. Do you think within the pool of people within the election that you can choose from, there is somebody there who is the right leadership to help Zimbabwe along that path?
I think if you look at values, principles, and individuals, you always get it wrong. Because we can look at the individuals, what are they going to do? They are prisoners in any way in the totality of the situation. But when you look at what Zimbabwe requires most, outside the elections, it's right policies, not right leader. One individual can't change. You look at what has happened. They put Mugabe so high. When he's out, actually you find there's no change in the cash shortages.
So you reckon with the right policies, it doesn't matter which leader you have in place as well, right?
Most leaders to me are prisoners. Have you ever seen a free leader who walks freely, who does things freely? Even I think I would beg to disagree with Professor. The army said they are not going to intervene. Even the correction, I think Mugabe had stayed too long.
Yes.
And it was a basket case, and even the judgment that he was making. But it's not Mugabe the person. ZANU-PF under Mugabe had problems coming back to the electorate. They had to fix that problem before coming to the vote, and they did their own way.
Yeah.
And so I don't believe that there is a risk of a coup. Somebody will emerge next week as either a runoff or as the leader. And remember, this is not the first time that you have these surprises. I think even Trump, whoever thought Trump would trump his way into White
There's a
House.
complete shift away in the general world, right, from
even
challenging the status quo.
Even France.
Exactly.
And if you look at Barack Obama, you look at things that have happened in our own generation. So I think Zimbabweans are not fools. I think after 38 years of trying the same medicine, and it has failed to give the results or deliver the promise.
Yeah.
And I don't think people will be smart enough to be stupid.
Quite a nice one. I love that. People won't be smart enough to be stupid. Political analyst Professor David Moore, and businessman and chairperson of the Africa Resources Limited, Mutumwa Mawere, as well. Joining us there as we unpack the Zimbabwe elections. Gentlemen, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can do this chat again. To you, Shante.